How's it going, you guys? Making this video on Thanksgiving, so happy Thanksgiving, you guys. In this video, I want to talk about a lot of the misconceptions and the myths and misunderstandings a lot of, so-called evidence-based experts and gurus like to preach. It's in particular pertaining to ketogenic diets, ketogenic metabolism, glycogen repletion, carbohydrate limits and intake, and how all this relates to athletic performance. So, it's really common for people when they go throughout their entire career seeing a certain subject through the lens of a particular ideology, that when new paradigms start to show themselves, such as ketogenic metabolism, these experts, they look at the scientific literature and they look at these paradigms, these new paradigms, through the lens of their current understanding and their current paradigm. So they're looking at ketogenic metabolism and athletic performance with the extreme bias of, you need carbs to function. And because they don't actually fully take the time to actually study in depth all of the great literature on ketogenic metabolism, they see these studies in a flawed manner. So I'm going to explain. There's a lot of things people are missing when they're interpreting studies on keto, especially comparing them to carbohydrate-based athletes. So, first of all, what is ketosis? Ketosis is simple, nutritional ketosis, not diabetic ketoacidosis. Nutritional ketosis is induced, it's pretty much any state where your body is producing over 0.5 millimolar of ketones per deciliter of blood. And so that can be induced through restricting carbohydrates, just to the extent where your body has to produce its own glucose, glycogen, and energy from fatty acids, essentially, through fat metabolism, whether that's turning fat into ketones or turning fat into a very small degree amino acids under severe protein restriction into glycogen and glucose. Okay, fasting can induce that, low carb can induce that, even exercise and caloric restriction with a higher carb intake can induce ketosis to a certain extent for a limited period of time. So even on a higher carb diet, you can produce ketones to an extent that can be defined as nutritional ketosis. It's just that it's not nearly to the same degree as when people restrict carbs or they do long-term fasting. So let's see. First misconception is that these experts claim you need exogenous carbohydrate sources to refill glycogen. That's false. Second misconception is that your body can produce glucose through gluconeogenesis from amino acids. Now that's true, but the problem that they're missing is your body's primary source of glucose production or glycogen production from gluconeogenesis is actually the glycerol backbone of triglycerides, which is a fatty acid molecule, and free fatty acids. So essentially, in layman's terms, you can actually produce glucose and glycogen from your exogenous fat intake, and more commonly, more primarily from body fat stores. Now, this process is extremely nuanced and it's extremely complicated, and it's also obviously extremely lesser known. But even these keto people claim that if you eat too much protein, it's going to automatically convert into glycogen or glucose and you can become diabetic from too much protein. But what they're missing is that gluconeogenesis only turns amino acids into glucose so there's a couple possibilities, but the main one is if your protein intake is inadequate for maintaining muscle production, okay, or muscle repair, then over time your body will start to break down. And of course, if you're not eating enough carbs, because carbohydrates, so if you're not eating enough carbs and you lose enough body fat to where your body has to start breaking down muscle to produce glucose demand, which is something like, I think overall like 40 grams of glucose a day, your body will start to break down muscle tissue under extreme starvation. So if you're anorexic, if you've been fasting for 40 days, or if you're on a ketogenic diet and you're not consuming adequate protein, your body will start to catabolize muscle tissue. So it's not from dietary protein, it's from muscle tissue that gluconeogenesis will usually get amino acids from. And in the context of a ketogenic diet, especially for athletes, you're only going to be producing glucose from muscle or from protein if you're not eating enough protein to begin with. So I don't know why assholes have to like purposely be louder to interrupt my video. It's unfortunate. Anyway, so these keto gurus that claim you need to eat low amounts of protein to prevent gluconeogenesis are actually doing the opposite. They're actually what that's going to do is it's going to create more muscle breakdown, which means more amino acids being catabolized from muscle tissue to create glucose. But the other thing is, if you're eating enough calories, if you're eating enough calories, whether that's from fat or from carbohydrate, obviously if you eat carbohydrate, even if you're not eating enough calories, your body won't need to break down muscle tissue to the same extent. But all I'm saying is muscle tissue is not a primary source of glucose or glycogen from gluconeogenesis, and dietary protein doesn't magically convert into glucose every time you eat it. If that was the case, ketogenic diets and carnivore diets and Atkins diets would not have all the, for one, anecdotes and stories, and for two, intervention trials showing an improvement in hemoglobin A1C levels to a significant degree. So, yeah, and then also we do have studies directly comparing 30% protein intake Atkins diets, modified Atkins diets, to the traditional 80% 80% fat ketogenic diets, and they measured blood ketones to see if the higher protein intake, 30% of your calories, that's a lot compared to fat. The lower fat intake and the higher protein intake in these studies did not hinder ketone production. So, yeah, that's a huge misconception with ketogenic diets, is that they need to be low protein, and number one, and number two, that, for your body magically stops producing glucose and whatnot, and you just run on ketones. And you can't do keto diets because you're not getting enough glucose and glycogen for athletic activity, because your body magically stops producing it. And then when you mention, hey, gluconeogenesis, then their response is, well, gluconeogenesis is a highly inefficient process, even though we don't have studies that show that. And they say that it uses muscle tissue, or in order to produce that or whatever. And that's not true. Now, the only exception is certain amino acids like alanine, in which case I would say just don't take BCAA supplements and stay away from beta-alanine if you're doing a ketogenic diet and you don't want excess glucose production. But even then, the amount of glucose that's produced from these amino acids is pretty damn small. I think it's like 0.5 grams of glucose per 1 gram of that individual amino acid. So you'd have to be taking in like 10 grams of alanine in order to produce 5 grams of glucose or something like that. And that's not enough glucose to kick you out of ketosis. So, no one fucking reads on this shit. It's like all these crazy comments, like hundreds and thousands of them. And these experts just make videos on this topic without actually researching it. So then the next thing is that you actually can eat a pretty hefty amount of exogenous carbohydrates and still stay in ketosis. So if you are burning through let's just say, I don't know, 500, I'm not going to get into mathematics, but if you're burning a lot of energy in MMA or, you know, some kind, or CrossFit or something like that throughout the day, you can easily take in anywhere from 50 to sometimes 100 grams or more of net carbs per day and still maintain well over 0.5 millimoles, or yeah, per deciliter of blood of ketones. The next day, you'll be right back into ketosis. You'll feel all the same benefits of ketosis, and you'll be able to have your cake and eat it too, literally. So, you know, and this is very common. There's plenty of athletes who do this, and they measure their ketones. You know, Rob Wolf talks a lot about this, and he follows a particular style of eating like that. So, I mean, you can still eat carbohydrates a large amount and stay in ketosis. So again, even if, like, you know, the FASTER study by Jeff Volok and Stephen Finney, which directly compared elite athletes, they're on a high carb diet to, you know, to the ketogenic crowd, even if that study is invalid and ketogenic dieters need exogenous carbs to sustain athletic performance, you can still fucking eat 50 to 100 grams of carbs on your hardest days. If you're actually needing that glucose, you can eat that glucose and then go right back into ketosis. So still, ketogenic diets are not as bad as these experts say. They don't understand, like, that's, I don't know why they think that you just can't do ketosis. You can stay in ketosis. A lot of these bodybuilders and whatnot that are on extremely calorically restricted diets and doing intense exercise and taking fat burners and thermogenics and all this, they're probably producing a pretty large amount of ketones, probably pushing the borders of on the verge of ketosis anyway. So even though they're eating carbs, but how much carbs are they eating? Under 150 grams a day to keep their calorie intake low. That's, especially if you're calorically restricted with intense exercise, yeah, you're probably in ketosis and don't even realize it. So the next thing I want to mention is that most of the studies comparing high carb dieters to so-called keto or low carb dieters, first of all, the carb intake is too high to be considered ketosis. So if a study says, you know, low carb compared to high carb diets and athletic performance, and the study group on the low carb end is eating anything over 80 grams per day, that is not considered ketogenic. Even though you could, you know, maintain ketosis at that level, that's not technically ketogenic. That's the first thing. So a lot of low carb and keto studies that people cite, you know, cause death and all this crap and lowers your athletic performance, they're not even you know, keto adapting because their carbs are just enough to keep them from entering ketosis. And so they're just on a low carb diet, probably experiencing hypoglycemia, but it's not directly comparing ketogenic diets, okay? Not to say that they could eventually. The second thing is that it takes 4 weeks to become keto adapted anyway. And the first 2 weeks you'll feel like crap. You'll have higher cortisol. Your electrolytes are probably imbalance, and a lot of these studies don't control for sodium intake. And then they end the study after, like, the studies usually don't last even 4 weeks. So if you look at the studies by Stephen Finney and Jeff Volok, they actually keto adapted athletes, and they took them through 4 weeks of keto adaptation, and they find improvements in athletic performance compared to high carb group, as well as lower power to weight ratio. So if you don't keto adapt athletes and the study only lasts like less than 4 weeks, you're going to get lower athletic performance because these athletes have not adapted the diet yet. And then if your carb intake is below 80 grams a day, you're not actually in a ketogenic state, or you're not comparing the ketogenic diet, okay? So my camera's about to stop because I ran out of space, which is, I hate this shit. So let me know down below any questions you have or any rebuttals, and I'll be happy to send you studies or anything that you want, anything I mentioned in this video especially. Talk to you guys next time.